Well, hello, welcome to the Speakeasy. My name is Paul Feasy, and I'm joined by...
I'm Glen Scrivener.
I'm Nate Morgan-Locke. Hello.
Same as always. And we have just watched...
We have just watched
the first two episodes of the new Amazon show, Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power.
a new telly program for us to dive into.
Yeah, supposedly the most expensive TV show ever made. Did you say
$58 million per episode.
Quite a bit.
And you can see it on the screen.
Which is only fractionally more than it costs to make one episode of the Speakeasy.
That's right.
This kind of set doesn't come cheap, you know.
Yeah. Now, we did try to make a reaction video in which
Yes.
we were responding in real time to the show, the two episodes that have been made available so far.
There's your 58 million right there.
But it wasn't a particularly good reaction video. And I think the reason it wasn't a particularly good reaction video is because it would be unbecoming to do a reaction in real time to something that is reliant on the work of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Why is that?
Because Tolkien, as Lewis, his great friend, believed that in order to properly criticize something or to appreciate something, you have to sort of submit yourself to that art form, and you have to allow it to sort of work its enchantment upon you. And so to do a kind of quick reaction video type thing is to stand, as it were, in the in the fire exit of the theatre and to make sort of snide comments rather than embracing what's going on.
Having only seen about 3% of the whole story as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
yeah.
But it's episodic, so I think you can sort. I think that's allowed.
Okay.
I think you can react to.
So we've digested
An
this
episode.
for
Yeah.
like an hour.
Yeah.
So we're now allowed to hold forth? Can we?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so.
All right.
It's just the talking during the episode, which is the problem. Isn't it? That was
But at least we didn't pause it, though. That's the worst, where people pause things while they're
Yeah.
watching it.
yeah.
And then talk
And there were
about
no
it.
adverts. That was a good thing.
That
Yes.
is a good
Which,
thing.
of course, often ruins television programs.
Yeah.
By sticking the adverts in.
Yeah.
So, Rings of Power. Like, where's it come from? So we have with us Nate Morgan-Locke, who styles himself as a reformed mythologist.
Amen. Amen.
So,
Yeah.
to describe for people who don't know what a reformed mythologist
What is a reform mythologist? So it's a nonsense, really, but it means that I get to talk about stories from a Christian perspective.
Okay.
So reformed is just a reference to my theology, and mythologist isn't really a thing, but I take mythos, the Greek word mythos, from which we get myth, I take that to refer to all types of stories. So whether it's folktale or fairy tale or mythology or Marvel Cinematic Universe film or Disney Pixar movie or whatever it might be. Now, I sort of had respect for Tolkien earlier on and said, no, we must not interrupt his show. But he would probably draw a distinction between myth and fairy tale and folktale, so I'm being a bit naughty there, pushing them all into one and saying it's all about story. And so really it's about the reform mythologist thing is just a way into let's think about story and storytelling from a Christian perspective.
Okay. And Paul, you're a big fan of Lord of the Rings.
Well, to the extent, yeah, I mean, I've read The Lord of the Rings, read the book, and I read the appendices. I've not read the Silmarillion.
Okay.
But and I've probably seen the films more than I read the books.
Okay.
So, you know, are you really a proper Lord of the Rings fan if you're really just more familiar with the films?
Yeah.
Probably not. Probably
But
some
you
purists out
have
there.
just watched the first two episodes of the television program, the most expensive television program of all time.
Yeah.
Whereas I have not read The Lord of the Rings, which is like a horrible admission for a Christian to make. I've read The Hobbit, but that's
Are
for
you
kids.
ordained?
Yeah, I know. Am I even saved? But and I'm gonna blame a kind of a monkey mind that I cannot hold 30 characters in my head at all.
Okay.
Like ever. And I've never been able to do it for these grand symphonic TV series like The Sopranos or The Wire or things like that.
Yeah.
I check out. I can't even read a menu because there's too many items on the
much
menu.
stuff going on.
I'm just like, chicken, fine.
Yeah.
I'm the same with my TV viewing. I'm just like, just give me Seinfeld. Okay, there are 4 characters. I know who those 4 characters are, and that's it. But are we able to hold 30 characters? And four contemporaneous plot lines in our minds at once, because it seems like it's quite a subsection of the human population that really gets into Tolkien and things like that. Are the others looking on from the outside because people like me are just not cognitively able to grasp it all?
I think there's two things. One is how are you able to deal with that many characters presented to you in literature, and then how are you able to cope with that presented to you on the screen?
Yeah.
And there are different rules about screen storytelling as there are about writing stories to be read by people. And the nice thing about reading is that you do it at your own pace, whereas the challenge with television, of course, is that it's just like bombarding you with stuff. And it relies upon a kind of sequential time relative thing to be to tell the story. And so one of the things we noticed about these first couple of episodes is that they are trying to introduce you to a whole world of characters in a very short space of time, and then have each of those characters have their own little kind of subplots that are going on, and with the trust that by the end of the season, I want you to have wrapped all these things together neatly in a bow so that none of it feels like it was a waste of time.
Yeah.
That somehow every single scene contributed to the resolution at the end of the story. And the part of the difficulty is you're not getting a lot of resolution because you're staying in these kind of isolated storylines for the characters. So it's one of the challenges I found with Stranger Things 4, which I think was the latest season of that, was just there are too many people to keep track of.
Right.
And like the jeopardy is kind of ramping up all the time because you're with a different group of people battling a different type of demon dog or whatever else it is. And you've got to kind of keep up with that. It's quite hard work. Whereas other forms of storytelling, and we've seen it done in television, will give you just a single character and then you explore the world through their eyes and that you go where they want to go. It's a much slower way of doing it because you have to work at the pace of the individual. So The Mandalorian was a fantastic example of having... plotted quite a lot like a video game, really, because you just watch this guy go on these little quests, and each episode he's going to do a new thing. Whereas this is very different. From the outset, we are being told, we need to tell you what's in this world. Yes. There's a lot of exposition in that first episode.
Maps and everything.
Yes, maps and voiceovers and montages and all the kind of classic stuff you do in filmmaking to get people up to speed with the story, and a couple of nice expositional conversations with people. So, how long have you been here again? 79 years, in fact. 79 years that these people who live here have been here, and yet we are. So it's quite a little bit sort of clunky in that sense, but. You've got, if you're wanting to paint the vivid picture of an entire world,
right?
Which you're doing because it's Tolkien's Middle Earth.
Yeah,
that's kind of essential.
And why do you want to do that? Why build a world? It's not planet Earth. It's Middle Earth, and it's not human. There are humans, but there's also elves and dwarves and orcs and all kinds of other creatures. It's just make believe. Isn't this tragic? Isn't this ultimately just a waste of time? Fairy tales. Why has, for instance, the Lord of the Rings series been the most successful, certainly fiction, written in English in the 20th century? Why have people wanted to give themselves to this other world?
Well, I guess with anything, whether it's something fantastical like Lord of the Rings, or even something that's a bit more, grounded in kind of our world. You might just think to yourself, I sit down and I watch something on the telly or I read a book because I like a good yarn.
Escapism.
Yeah, escapism. And obviously there is truth in that. But I think often stories speak to us on a deeper level as well, don't they? So like, in the Lord of the Rings, you could just say, there's a very superficial kind of watch through, like, it's just a little adventure about some people, trying to
walking a lot,
going on a big walk in some nice scenery, and there's some goodies and some baddies, but that would be quite a superficial reading, I guess, of it. And I think there are the character relationships and the you've got your Frodo and your Sam, and you know, that Frodo has to go through this thing and goes through sort of darkness, and it kind of actually tears him down, and he never fully recovers. And you know, there's a lot more going on there than just, oh, you know, Goody goes and defeats baddie.
Right.
And I think those things do speak to us. You know, whether we're always aware of those things. You know, the character who does the right thing in the face of you know, great struggle and hardship. You know, that speaks to us about something bigger than ourselves, I think. So, but I know exactly what you mean, though, because my father-in-law is literally just like, well, that would never happen. And he won't watch anything, basically, as long as, if it's not football, not interested. That would never happen. So,
well, there was even a part of me in there's a scene very early on where a young Galadriel is told by her brother, "Do you know why stones sink and boats float?" And I'm thinking, yes, buoyancy.
Ballast.
If a body is able to displace a greater body of water than the weight of the object, then the buoyancy will.
So
will
you're a
keep it afloat.
materialist.
Yeah, basically. Aren't
You
we all?
are
Though? Aren't we all?
reduced-
But then the example, what he says to his sister is, it's because stones have their eyes downwards towards the abyss, whereas boats
Darkness.
have their eye. What? Boats have their eyes
Boats
towards the
are-
light,
yeah.
and towards the above. And you're like, okay. I mean, that's a far more like Christian answer, dare I say.
An enchanted world.
An enchanted world.
But I think part of you talk about why would you bother? Well, for a lot of this stuff, it's not worth bothering with, right? For so many stories that are out there which people are trying to tell, and I'm trying to get you to read this, or I want you to sort of listen to my story that I've got. They aren't. They don't stick. They don't sell. They don't work. They don't get put on TV, and if they do, not a lot of people want to watch them. Like, it's really, really hard to make any kind of story world that anyone's going to want to stay in. So the fact that Tolkien was able to do it with Lord of the Rings, and not only create a world that is filled with opportunities for his fans to kind of dive into what he's written, but then apparently with this show, there's enough kind of a gap in the annals of the kings of Numenor or whatever it is that you can make an entire 5-season, 10 episodes a season kind of TV show. So that is a level of world building which has clearly worked, right? He knows what he's doing. And so the only question is not why would anybody enjoy a story about elves and dwarves and hobbits, but why would this story of Middle-earth, why would Middle-earth work? Because he's onto something, and without what he was able to do, you wouldn't have a whole bunch of other things in the fantasy
what did
genre.
Tolkien think he was doing? Because, I mean, did he spend something like 17 years kind of building the world and inventing a language, Elvish, and kind of... so he clearly thinks it's worth his time.
So there are two things that seem to sort of come up. One is that he's a philologist, right? So
which is
someone who studies people called Phil. Philology. No, so he studies language. That's his expertise. And so he's interested in all sorts of languages that no one speaks anymore. He was like an expert in Anglo-Saxon and all this sort of stuff. Norse, and Old English. And so he's fully into the wonder of language and how it works. We're talking about language. And
what?
And in a way, what he does with his obsession with language. In fact, I want to read something to you. This is a slightly weird thing for me to do because I've been reading through some of his essays and lectures and things, knowing that we were preparing for this program.
We told you we had a reformed mythologist.
And
people.
so I was reading this. This is really funny, right? This is a secret vice. So this is Tolkien giving a lecture to a group of people in Oxford University, I think, in like the 30s, maybe, something like that. He says this. He was sitting next to a friend of his. I promise this will land, but it might just take a while to get there. It's just really important.
A bit like Lord of the Rings.
Because of the philology, because of the obsession with language, right? So he was sitting in this tent. He was in the army. He's sitting in this kind of tent, and there's this army officer who's going on about something, and he's not really listening. Anyway, The man next to me, so a fellow soldier, said suddenly in a dreamy voice, "Yes, I think I shall express the accusative case by a prefix." And then this is what Tolkien says. "A memorable remark. Of course, by repeating it, I have let the cat so carefully hidden out of its bag, or at least revealed the whiskers. But we won't bother with that for a moment. Just consider the splendour of the words. I shall express the accusative case. Magnificent. Not it is expressed, nor even the more shambling it is sometimes expressed, nor the grim you must learn how it is expressed." So he is listening to someone who is coming up with his own language.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He's developing his own language.
In the
and
active
in
voice.
his language, he wants to make a distinction between the accusative case and whatever other cases there would be,
Nominative,
ablative,
dative,
whatever, right?
Yeah.
So he says a prefix would be an excellent way of expressing this particular case in my own language.
Yeah.
And Tolkien's just like, that is magnificent. What an amazing thing to say. That's the most wonderful thing you could possibly do. Whereas, of course, most people are going to go, that sounds tedious and ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
And then there's another one where he says, "I knew two people who constructed a language called animalic, almost entirely out of English animal, bird, and fish names. And they conversed in it fluently to the dismay of bystanders. I was never fully instructed in it, nor a proper animalic speaker, but I remember out of the rag bag of memory that dog, nightingale, woodpecker 40 meant you are an ass." So that's what he calls it his secret vice. Tolkien is obsessed with language. He's absolutely obsessed with language. And the idea that you could create your own language for him is absolutely wonderful. Now, put that together with his interest in Englishness and the history of England, and he's a medievalist at some level, and his desire for there to be a proper mythology of England.
Yeah.
And you have The Lord of the Rings. You build a world with a language, and that world is giving you the mythology of the English.
Yes. Because the Norse myths were much more involved.
Yeah.
In English, in Old English, you have Beowulf, which he was a great expert in. But apart from that, he's saying we don't really have a kind of an origin story for England, and like Lord of the Rings is it? Is this?
Well, in a way, it sort of is. And so when you take, in a Hobbit, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit, and you start with the Shire, and a very kind of cozy knit group of people who would like to sit and smoke a pipe and drink some beer, and maybe in the summer have a little party with some more food, and who get obsessed about like spoons and things, which is like there's a family of hobbits who do that in the Hobbit, I think, who are concerned about their spoons and getting their inheritance.
Yes. Yeah. It's pretty English.
So it's this kind of small parochial, bucolic kind of world of pleasantness, and yet with some dark clouds around, because there's a northernness to kind of the British Isles and being English as well. So you put that in, and the sense of imposition that then comes with a bunch of dwarves turning up and a wizard and telling you you've got to go and on a mission to meet a dragon, and all of that then offers, as a children's book version, to sort of precede the world building that increases in Lord of the Rings. It is kind of saying, here are the challenges of that, but it's fundamentally linguistically based. It's based in language, and which is why it has so much fun creating all these other peoples and groups and their own languages and poems every 2 pages or what.
Yes, and is there something to the time period in which Tolkien is writing? Like two big themes I'm thinking. One is industrialization and the sort of the shireness of Britain going through the 19th century, and that sort of process of the skies being choked and being ground down in the factories and that kind of thing. And then the other massive thing being World War I, which he fought in. He was at the Somme. He miraculously in some ways, came back from the Somme and sort of returned to the Shire? Is there a sense of him being from that sort of small little Middle England and going and facing off against the beast and coming back to the Shire? But it's different now.
Well, people do talk about that. I don't know. I don't know if people say it's overplayed, but that sense that when they return, well, it's different in the films than in the books, isn't it? Because in the books they return to the Shire destroyed, like the scourging of the Shire at the end of Lord of the Rings. Whereas in the film version they go back, but there is a scene, isn't there, with 4 of them in the bar where they look round at everyone and there's that sense in which they've all gone through something that no one else will understand, and they are forever changed by it. And particularly we see that in Frodo. Frodo himself will never heal from what he's gone through, which people say is kind of pointing in some extent to like the soldiers who go to war and come back and life is forever changed. So.
But again, that's one of the reasons why Lord of the Rings succeeds, is because it isn't allegorical in the sense that it's not saying, well, this is Russia and this is the atomic bomb and this is everything else. In fact, Lewis talks about that. I'll read his review of Lord of the Rings in a minute because it's fascinating. But the key thing, and what Tolkien is after with Lord of the Rings, is not that it be political, but that it be mythical. It be much less kind of, how do I apply this to the current political climate?
It's not directed by Adam McKay. It's not. Don't Look Up.
And that is one of the major challenges of making the Rings of Power TV show, is that we are now all convinced that television and storytelling and filmmaking and books and whatever else there is, they only have a cultural value in a cultural war, which is happening right now. Yeah. So there's nothing mythic. There's nothing that's properly human. There's definitely nothing religious. There's definitely nothing philosophical. Yeah. It is just about
political,
winning a culture war and making television to provide, or films to provide, ammunition on social media platforms, right? It's as though, and that I think was why Tolkien would really struggle with the fact that they're making this television program. Yeah, is because you're sort of cheapening the kind of the grand narratives, the meta narratival sense.
So you think that they are playing into just like a cultural war, rather than like, here's a big myth.
Yeah, I think it's become. I mean, having just only watched 2 episodes, granted, it's a long way to kind of go and all that sort of stuff, but it doesn't feel. It sort of feels like it's set in Tolkien's world, but the language has been so updated and so is so loaded with kind of cultural significance that it just feels on the nose. It feels a bit kind of, all right, okay. Was this strictly necessary?
So give us some examples then.
I suppose part of the kind of expositional stuff that was in the first episode just felt there's a conversation that takes place between, is it Norrie Brandybuck? I think there might be a name.
Brandyfoot?
Who's one of the Half-Foots.
Half-Foot.
Incredibly on the nose explanation of what this show is about. In the explanatory conversation between a mother and child. She has a sort of conversation with her mother in which her mother kind of sort of lists out all the different races and peoples of Middle Earth, and says how they are sort of for themselves and we should all kind of know our place. And you have this young girl that sort of, well, I don't believe anything. That sort of, and she's being set up to be someone who's going to break all the categories that we've got and this sort of thing, which is fundamentally political. It's here are some categories of things that are out there, and that I am sort of an activist for breaking down sort of dividing walls. Now, you don't need to do that in Lord of the Rings. People will naturally bump up against each other, and out of a sort of frustrating necessity have to kind of deal with each other and all the difficulties that they have with it. You don't sort of have this sense, certainly for characters in their infancy, if you like, who are thinking about crossing all the cultural barriers that it's possible to cross, and why can't we all sort of embrace one another in a big kind of group hug. So that's one of the things that great storytelling reveals that to the characters. It doesn't start off with a character who's on a mission to go and change the world. It's like, okay, Bilbo, to go back to the Hobbit, was not trying to leave the Shire. Right. He did not want to leave the Shire. Right. And the fact that he had to was very difficult for him to deal with. Right. And that is a sense of kind of great mythic story, the refusal of the call.
Yes. So in like the Lord of the Rings, so with Gimli and Legolas, they are very much kind of, elves and dwarves don't mix, you know, but of course they're thrown together and they become friends through it, and there is this kind of development. It's not kind of, they're not idealistic kind of progressive dwarf, progressive elf before it starts.
It's just that sort of acknowledgement that we are slightly strange, co-belligerents, and we're actually fighting, they do it in Lord of the Rings films. It's like this kind of battle for who can kill the most, who can take. But there's a kind of remarkable deep respect that comes. But that's one of the things you draw out through the story. Characters who are not acting as proxy for the author's political or cultural viewpoints, having to sort of constantly express that. Let the story reveal that to both reader and to the protagonist.
You said about Tolkien not perhaps being delighted that Amazon Prime was going to take this up. Certainly Tolkien's fans have responded pretty negatively overall in terms of how these first two episodes, or even just the proposition that someone was going to build on Tolkien's world. That is really making a rod for your own back, isn't it? Trying to enter into the world of the fan and keep everybody happy.
Well, and that's the thing. It's franchise storytelling. Yeah. You have a fandom, which is why you're going to tell this story, because there's already a group of people who are going to buy tickets to it or pay the subscriptions. Yeah. It's a calculated financial decision to tell this story. That's not what Tolkien was doing. Yeah. It's not what, if you're going into this to make money, you're not going in it to tell a great story. And then you're into the battle of who knows best, the customer, and, how do you balance that out with everything else. So you don't want fan service. You don't want just to give people exactly what they want because they own the characters. But at the same time, you don't also just want to be undermining a bit of storytelling and world building. I mean, I didn't actually think it was so terrible because I think we'd already sold the farm when we had the Peter Jackson films. I was like, I still haven't watched the Hobbit films because I'm just like, what are you doing? I do not need 3 films to tell me the story
of which you can read in half the time.
So.
What about you as a fan, Paul? What were you expecting going into watching the first 2 episodes, and what did you find?
I didn't know what to expect, to be honest. Like I said, I've not read any of the Silmarillion or that kind of stuff, so I don't really know anything about the narrative story of it. I like shows or franchises, whatever you want to call it, that have a lore and a history. So. If I'm watching something, I like those episodes of a story where you're like, oh, this is taking us further down the road of the lore and the history, rather than, sometimes you get those episodes which are just filler material.
Christmas special episodes.
Yeah. So, I think, I don't know, at the beginning, you've got the opening scenes are all about sort of Morgoth and this kind of dark power that there was and, that stuff. Like, for me, I like that side of it. In a sense, there's maybe like 4 or 5 different strands going on in the story, aren't there? Now, I don't know where any of them are going. Like, you go into it, I suppose you go in thinking, or I go in thinking, presumably these are going to tie together in some way. You know, I mean, I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah.
You know, I enjoyed it.
Mm.
I enjoyed. You know, I thought it was a good watch. You know, obviously it looks phenomenal in terms of what they've done. It should do for $58 million an episode.
Per episode, yeah.
You know, at that stage, if it doesn't look good,
Good
you've
questions.
got problems.
Yeah.
You know, but I mean, I think it's trying to deal with. I like the fact it's trying to deal with this big thing. You know, Sauron is the big bad in Lord of the Rings, isn't he? Although you never really see him. And so to get the kind of the history of that, the formation, you get that even in The Hobbit, though. There's bits of that in The Hobbit, isn't there, that they dip into. You know, so I'm intrigued to kind of see where it goes.
Yeah. Yeah. And apart from a few Basil exposition moments, Nate, overall, it was a good watch, wasn't it?
Yeah, fine. Yeah. I don't know if I'll watch any more of it, because I'm like, okay, it's just every episode's now long, and that's partly because, you know, there are things I think are great TV, right? So I personally found Vince Gilligan's Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul to be outstanding as television, which show not tell, and it's show-o-vision, maybe, not television. So there's something to be said for
the tell is actually from the Greek.
using television as television, and yeah, there's something. You know, Tolkien didn't make a TV program. Tolkien wrote a grand fantasy novel, and would it have survived if he'd initially started off with making a TV program? Right, because TV programs aren't novels. So, like, and you need to update television and film all the time when the technology starts to look really weak and pathetic, and people sort of go, oh wow, that's kind of cringy and dated. You don't tend to do that with books in the same way. They tend to last. You might possibly, you know, update some of the language if it's hundreds of years later, but of course television and film's a much younger medium. But yeah, I just think it's it's fine, you know. I'm not angered.
Well, that's
I'm
good.
also
We were worried, weren't we?
not astonished.
You don't want to see Nate angry.
I as I said earlier when we were watching it, and we probably got the clip that we can show, I was very happy with the way in which an animal was shown on the screen at one particular point.
Yeah.
You could just give it a look.
Best cow reveal I've seen for a long time.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful
The cow reveal.
point. The cow reveal.
Yeah, one of the best you've ever seen.
Yeah, probably the best.
Probably,
I
like,
think.
wow.
Never
you
seen a
thought-
better
Praise.
revealed cow.
You thought, interestingly, relatively early on, you said something like about how fast it was moving,
Yeah.
how quick it all was.
Early
Let's not
days.
get into this. It's moving far too quickly.
Too quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, actually, I was sitting there thinking, some of this feels quite slow to me.
Okay.
Because it seemed to be like, here's another scene
Yeah.
of two elves having a talk,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And for me, and I could see why
But they were
someone
talking
would watch
too
it.
much. That was
Yeah.
Stop.
Too much information.
Let's get
I could
some-
see why someone would watch it and say,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you know, generally stuff does move quickly these days because it doesn't seem people having the attention span for it. But you know, if you've got a series that you can draw out, then why not slow it down? You know, and you know, because generally the first episode, I got to the end of the first episode and I thought, okay, it's obviously tried to set up lots all at once, and maybe they didn't need to introduce all 4 bits at once. They could have introduced a couple of bits, and then you know, there'd be a few more that begin to creep in. But like it didn't feel to me, you know, I think I felt at the end of the episode, I don't know where it's going yet. You know, I don't know where this. There's no sort of. None of those stories had a. Obviously, there's not going to be a resolution.
Yeah.
But even at the end of an individual episode, you expect there normally to be something that makes you keep going. So the weakness of that first episode, I felt, was that it feels like classic first episode thing, where you know, people might watch it and go, oh well, I don't know what's going on, And I go, you're not supposed to know what's going on at this point. That's okay,
Hang in there.
And there's another. I think I can't. Well, we've watched 2 episodes, can't we? So I can't remember which was in what now. But I think, okay, you've got these different storylines. You've kind of got the Elrond storyline, which is about the forging of the rings, and you're like, okay, well, that's interesting to me. I want to see where that goes. You've got the storyline with Galadriel, who's looking for Sauron. Okay, that ties in with the big story. That's okay. I'm good with that. Yeah. We've got the Meteor Man.
Who's the Meteor Man?
Who is the Meteor Man that's fallen from the sky with the kind of little hobbits? Yeah. I'm like, okay, that's a bit mysterious. And then there's the other one. What was it? The
wrong one with the cow.
Yeah, that one's a bit more left of field. Yeah. But you're kind of like, okay, there's something going on there with the whatever's going on under the ground. Yeah. So there's enough in there for me to be like, okay, I want to see where each of those goes, and I'm working on the basis that they will come through together at some point. Yeah.
And I think we still, even though we've got these contemporaneous strands, we probably do have the sense that Galadriel it's her story. Yeah. I mean, probably because she is
his story.
She's her story. And she is the narrator at the start, which is a little bit of a throwback to Cate Blanchett in Lord of the Rings. It begins with her in this Edenic paradise sort of thing, and there's a kind of a fall, and then you get this sense of she is offered heaven, and instead she chooses the struggle on earth. She chooses to, cast herself into the deep abyss in order to eradicate evil, or is it just for vengeance? Yeah. Wow. Gave it all up for the sake of vengeance.
Because she knew in here, then.
That she wanted to touch the darkness. And as soon as she did that, I said hero, right? And then you said...
I can't remember exactly what I said.
But not a very Tolkien-y hero.
Yes, not a very Tolkien. So it is. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the little girl who wants to, get rid of all the, distinctions, and everyone can live sort of happily in some sort of one city in which all the different types of inhabitants of Middle Earth can gather together.
That would never happen.
So. Yes, the challenge for it being a Tolkien hero is that the heroes Tolkien has written into Middle-earth are Christian heroes, by which I mean they are types of Christ. So this was possibly the worst idea for an evangelistic outreach event ever. Okay. Was that I was working for the All Souls Clubhouse, and All Souls Langham Place in London decided they wanted to do a showing of the director's cut of the Lord of the Rings films, the extended versions. They were going to show all 3 films on one Saturday evening. Yep. And in between these films, I was going to get up and give a short evangelistic
everyone's
talk.
Gone to the loo. Let's be very clear.
It was like... This could be the worst thing ever. In one sense, it was really good for me because it meant that I went into those books and I went into the films and was really kind of thinking through, okay, so Tolkien is a Christian. He's avowedly Catholic, and he's very, he's evangelistically so, right? That's why Lewis became a Christian. And so he's clearly hasn't written a Christian allegory, and he clearly hasn't written a clear Christ type in the sense that Aslan performs a Christ type in Narnia. But what he has done is that he's given you, in the figures of Frodo and Aragorn, or Strider/Aragorn and Gandalf, he's given you pictures of Christ that you can find scripturally. So Frodo is the suffering servant. Yeah. He is the one who's bearing the burden. He's the one who's weak and pathetic and, can't really do much. He's only just a hobbit, and he will go down through suffering. He will be innocuous, and he will not be seen by Sauron, who can only see power.
He will not take power for himself and be corrupted.
And the weakness of the suffering servant is, by his stripes, in a sense, by his suffering journey, the people will be healed. You've then got Aragorn as the returning king, and the one who's been sort of exiled away from his people and living a life sort of as a stranger and alien in the world, who then comes back to reclaim as the heir of Isildur and who's going to be the returning king. And then, of course, Gandalf, and here's a spoiler, Gandalf the Grey, after his battle with the Balrog, you shall not pass, will go down into the many, many deep depths before returning, I think, is it the Battle of Helm's Deep or wherever it is, and he comes back and he's now Gandalf the White. So he's the resurrected king, the one who's gone down to be raised up, more glorious than before. Yep. So you've got these like very strong messianic pictures that are woven into the mythology of Middle-earth. And then the challenge is that we're taking an alternate view of heroism and the hero, taken much more postmodern, much more individualistic, much more in terms of an internal call, which is, I think, what so far we seem to have seen with Galadriel, who is, you put it brilliantly, she's more Moana than...
Well, I think with Nori Brandyfoot feels more Moana-y. Than a Bilbo does. Yeah. Again, adventure is thrust on the hobbits. They want to stay in the Shire, and yet they are just thrust out. The adventure sweeps them up, and they don't want to be a hero. They don't want to sacrifice. They just want Elevenses. Yeah. And yet Nori Brandyfoot does seem a lot more like Moana. The Shire is too small for me, and I want to be cosmopolitan. I want to go to the big smoke, and so that's a very modern kind of a hero. And again, with Galadriel, the call to adventure is this: no one else is calling for her to do this apart from herself. And at the moment, it just looks like a kind of a vengeance thing to avenge her brother's death. Yeah. But maybe it is to extinguish evil for the sake of Middle-earth. But again, that call comes from within. And I do wonder whether in the 1930s, you fought at the Somme. What kind of heroism do you have? The kind of heroism that you're going to write about is getting swept up into an adventure that you did not choose for yourself. Yeah. Whereas I wonder in 2022, certainly pre-2020, the idea of war, famine, and pestilence is not really in your purview, and so you're much more the Disney princess. You're much more. The adventure, the call to adventure comes from within, and you're the sort of the hero that's going to engage with things off your own bat. And I'll always remember Primo Levi, who was a Jew at Auschwitz. He survived Auschwitz and wrote a number of harrowing books about it. And he went to the States after the war, and he tells this story of explaining, I think it's to his grandson, about what it was like at Auschwitz. And his grandson was like, why didn't you just beat up the guard, put his uniform on, steal his gun, and Uzi your way out of the camps? And Primo Levi was like, what has Hollywood done to people? And the sort of the modern idea of the hero is this sort of self-willed, sparky, awaken the hero within yourself, and you can kind of do it. But if you've lived through the Somme, or if you've lived through Auschwitz, you know that you're just in a meat grinder, and you just must go through this. And I just wonder whether the expressive individualist side of things is more at the core of Galadriel, more at the core of Nori, than could have ever been the case if you were just writing in a post-war setting.
I don't know how. I'd be interested to know how much of that story, like the Galadriel stuff, is based on the actual text, or how much of that is just
Well, she's meant to be married at this stage, apparently. So this is made according to the appendices. There are a number of appendices at the end of Lord of the Rings, and they tell some of the lore of the Second Age. But apparently, in that lore, she is married. But they've obviously taken the decision that she needs to be single because she's found herself on a boat with a strapping lad.
Yeah. And that's the challenge of doing prequels rather than doing sequels, right? Yeah. So you've got to land at, presumably, Cate Blanchett's Galadriel at the start of the first Lord of the Rings film. You're filling in, so you're restrained in terms of what you can do at one level. But... yeah, and what is driving that? What is driving the desire for filling in the blanks of the Second Age of Middle-earth?
Yeah.
right? Well, is it just that the fans were just kind of saying, when will someone finally solve this conundrum of how we ever got to this kind of Sauron guy in the first place? I will never be satisfied that Tolkien knew what he was doing unless Jeffrey Bezos pays someone $58 million a movie or an episode to tell us this story. We've always been wondering. It's not that at all. It's just the fact that there is this franchise with a hole in the plot. Is probably not even that. Because, but Tolkien's giving
Or it's a
you
bit of a
those-
sandpit. It's a bit of a sand, and Tolkien has given you some raw materials.
In which case, play Lord of the Rings Dungeons and Dragons. It's like
Don't do it for the money.
Actually play in it rather than like then
Right, and
you
charge for tickets. Yeah. Okay.
It's just
All right.
it is a cold, calculated decision. Okay, if Amazon was to appear as a sort of its equivalent in Middle Earth, it would not be the good guys. That's the thing you've got to remember. Same with Disney. If the Disney Corporation appeared in a Disney movie, they would not be the good guys.
Yeah.
Because that it's
we
just
the
not
baddies.
possible. Yeah.
Yes, you are. Okay. Two things about this, and then we should probably wrap up. But one is people talk about Tolkien washing. Has the Amazon Prime series been Tolkien washing? And by that, I guess people think that writing in the 1930s, as a traditional Catholic, there are features of Tolkien's worlds that must be cleansed, that must be corrected, and brought up to date.
They must be ethnically cleansed.
Ethnically re-diversified,
yeah.
perhaps. And then we'll get onto the second issues about like good and evil. Is it just a kind of a bland black and white kind of thing? But on the Tolkien washing thing, at their strongest, what are people trying to say in terms of Tolkien needs to be updated?
I suppose, I mean, the thing that's in there is the fact that you've got Lenny Henry playing a Harfoot, which is a type of hobbit. Well, I don't exactly know.
A pre-Hobbit hobbit.
And so people are going, oh, there's black and Asian actors being cast in roles which, the certainly the Lord of the Rings films, the Peter Jackson films, didn't have an ethnically diverse cast of hobbits. So that's a change you've made since 2001 or whatever it was. So that then feels as though Tolkien and his approach to race, or his view of people, has been updated for a 21st century audience. Well, even updated, for the third decade of the 21st century.
Yeah.
So that's what people, I think, are anxious about. I don't think is a big deal at all. I do find the criticism when people say, "Oh, if you get upset about black elves, then they're elves, for goodness sake," and the difficulty I have with that level of kind of dismissiveness around people's concern for taking the work of Tolkien and then updating it is to say you can't break this thing. It needs to retain some of its own nature. And there's a bit in Orthodoxy where Chesterton talks about things being sort of according to their nature. See if I can find it. But he says, yes, the artist is one who... anarchism adjures us to be bold, creative artists and care for no laws or limits. But it is impossible to be an artist and not care for laws and limits. Now, I've got to be careful because I'm not saying you can't have a black elf or you can't have a black hobbit. But in a world which is very much about the Toledot as the generations of these people.
Hebrew word there, people. Hebrew word.
So it appears throughout the early chapters of Genesis to talk about these are the generations of Adam or Noah or whoever it is. You're in a genealogical world. and you're in a world of different kind of species. There are men and there are dwarves and there are elves. These are not the same things. There are giants, there are wizards, there are hobbits. So you're in a world which has its own sort of nature. Therefore, you need to be able to account for any changes within that nature that you make. If you suddenly decide, well, all hobbits now have shaved heads or completely straight hair, well, that doesn't feel very hobbity. It's not sort of according to the rules of what a hobbit is that were originally written by Tolkien, whether or not you think he was right to do that. So the key thing, and Chesterton goes on to say this, he says, the moment you step into the world of facts, you step into a world of limits. So there are limits of it. You can't have an 8-foot hobbit. That's an odd thing. It ceases to be a hobbit.
Sizist.
Yeah, well, so
He believes in apartheid.
so he says, you may free a tiger from his bars, but do not free him from his stripes. Do not free a camel of the burden of his hump. You may be freeing him from being a camel. Do not go about as a demagogue, encouraging triangles to break out of the prison of their 3 sides. If a triangle breaks out of its 3 sides, its life comes to a lamentable end. Somebody wrote a work called The Loves of the Triangles. I never read it, but I'm sure that if triangles were ever loved, they were loved for being triangular. And this is certainly the case with all artistic creation. So it just is that sense that you are working with material and therefore you've got restraints on it. You need to somehow have a way of accounting for this. And are you then, in making these choices, dismissing the Third Age in which there were not, black hobbits, for example? So it's just one of those things where you just
they go from Irish to Scottish. So
yeah. Yeah.
How does that work?
Oh, I mean, the accents thing is the other one, right? In terms of what accents are chosen for the different groups, elves must always speak and receive pronunciation.
Yeah.
Right? You can't have elves going, you're all right, Galadriel.
Yeah.
When are we going to go?
Yeah.
You've got to go on the boat. You've got to go to Grey Hivens. We're going now. Come on. We're going to be there eternity. It's going to be great. That's not the voice of an elf.
Yeah.
But if you choose to make that the voice of an elf, you somehow need to kind of give an account for it.
Yeah.
And so,
but people would say, people would say that that's the, like if you say, oh, you've got these hobbits, and they've all got, some of them are Irish, some of them sound Jamaican, some of them, some of them, sound a bit sort of, black country kind of area. But there's, again, what they've done is they've taken, some people would look at that and say, oh, look at the diversity that they've brought in. But because they've got elves who speak in a certain way, but you've got the kind of Shire folk, if they are actually from the Shire in this one, but they're kind of more the country bumpkin kind of characters. You could argue, say, well, they've kind of just a bit of a stereotypes there, that they've taken these kind of accents and said, well, these people are all a bit like this, aren't they? But I think you're right that stuff has to work within its. If you've got a universe that you establish and it has its own established laws. Someone come in and say, oh, yeah, but it's all made up, so you can just do what you like. And you go, you can do whatever you like, but that just completely breaks the whole thing. I feel this about Doctor Who. When they made the Doctor into a woman, now I would say, people go, no, they're an alien, they can do what they like. And they go, but the established history of the show is there are male and female of this species. And it's only, it seems to me, what a coincidence that we've brought this into it when in society it's become a political vehicle. So, whilst I'm like, I don't have an issue with the character being a woman, I'm like, to me, it breaks the rules of the show. And so, and on the large scale, you go, it doesn't really matter, just a TV show. But it's a valid criticism to say, you need to have a reason for that. You can't just go, oh, we'll just change everything because that's what we fancy doing at the moment. I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
Exactly. You've got, so it is a bit like the kind of, the sandbox or the let's pretend thing, is that if someone's making their own little pretend world and I say, oh, we're going to run over here and this is a thing, and then someone comes over and says something that contradicts that, well, I was actually quite happy playing this, just playing this game, and people might say, well, that means you can't play with others. You're not very good. As a human being, you should learn to compromise. You should learn to sort of embrace. But in a way, we want to live in a world that someone has made and which is governed by its own rules, and it has its own integrity as a world. It's one of the things that makes Marvel so difficult to watch since the end of the Infinity Saga, is the fact that they keep on undermining their own premise all the time, so that if they're not going to take it seriously, then why should anyone else? And if it's just a joke, if every single film is just a comedy, well, we become poorer for it, because and that's one of the things I do actually really like about this TV show, is that it is taking itself seriously. I mean, some people might think it be too po-faced. I think it's genuine, and the people are acting out their fantasy drama, their elves and dwarves, in a way that shows that they care about it. They think it's got value.
But getting back to Lenny Henry, I don't think any of us had any problem believing that he was a hobbit or a pre-hobbit hobbit, whatever form he's in, that he's a kind of a Shire folk. And I think in the conversation here, there's a level of how you view it that is above the level of what you think is going on in the story. And I think in 2022, the viewer just necessarily notices when every character is white, because that's not the world that you live in when you watch the BBC. You know, even crime dramas that are set in Scotland that is overwhelmingly white. Suddenly, the DCI who shows up is black and his girlfriend is Asian, and but we expect a diversity on screen, and you almost start to notice it when you don't. And so in one sense, when you see Lenny Henry as a Hobbit type character, that's kind of, he's more invisible in 2022 than he would have been in 2001, for instance, and much more invisible, and he would have been extremely visible if he was in the 50s or something like that.
But he still looks like Lenny Henry, doesn't he? We all said that. Do you mean Lenny?
He's a strong
Lenny
character.
Henry got a character? He's called Lenny Henry. You sort of feel.
But what the 2022 decision relies on is a certain colorblindness, which I think is fascinating, because actually some of the people who are most in favor of saying no, you don't break the rules, hobbits, they're white, tend to be the sort of people who like the Martin Luther King thing and the colorblindness, and you should be judged by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin. And actually, as soon as you buy, Lenny Henry is a hobbit, and his great grandson is going to be Ian, what's his name, Ian Holm. As soon as you buy that, you've become really quite colorblind, haven't you?
Right,
And I think in quite a pleasing way. So I think you can fall into, I think there's a whole bunch of people who are falling off either side of the wrong horse on this. And the sort of people who, underneath the John Lewis, Christmas commercial say, oh, every couple's a mixed race couple. You can't get away from mixed race couples. I think that is ridiculous. But I think it's just as ridiculous as the person who complains that all the contestants for Miss Scotland are white. They are both mirror images of the same folly, really. Yeah. And actually, I do wonder whether, a Lenny Henry as a hobbit, as soon as you buy that and go with it and just say, at the level of me viewing it, whatever. But I understand that hobbits are all of one kind, and I understand that he is the ancestor of a whole bunch of people who end up being white. Yeah. Actually, you end up at quite a colorblind kind of place when you believe that.
And in a weird way, Lenny Henry sounds like a hobbit kind of name, right? And that's the name. Going back to the linguistic thing and the name thing. Yeah. When you are creating a fictional world, you choose names for your characters. That's one of the things that Lewis picks up on. Just to read his thing, I did promise we'd look at this. So when Lewis is writing his basically review of The Lord of the Rings, he's very positive about it. Tolkien was famously a bit more dismissive of the Narnia Chronicles. But this is what Lewis says. The utterly new achievement of Professor Tolkien is that he carries a comparable sense of reality unaided. Probably no book yet written in the world is quite such a radical instance of what its author has elsewhere called subcreation. The direct debt, there are, of course, subtler kinds of debt, which every author must owe to the actual universe, is here deliberately reduced to the minimum. So he's properly making something as different from the real world as kind of as is possible, suggests Lewis. He says, not content to create his own story, he creates with an almost insolent prodigality. That's a nice phrase, isn't it? Insolent prodigality. The whole world in which it is to move, with its own theology, myths, geography, history, paleography, languages, and orders of beings, a world full of strange creatures beyond count. The names alone are a feast, where the redolent of quiet countryside, Michael Delving, South Farthing, I don't know if that's Michael or Michelle Delving, I don't know. Tall and kingly, Boromir, Faramir, Elendil, loathsome like Smeagol, who is also Gollum, or frowning in the evil strength of Barad-dûr or Gorgoroth, yet best of all, Lothlorien, Gilthoniel, Galadriel, when they embody that piercing, high elvish beauty of which no other prose writer has captured so much. So he's really dialing into the fact that Tolkien's ability to create using words is unparalleled. Yeah. And he does that because he's studied language. He knows the kind of assonance and resonance and the metrics of language. And so therefore when he builds a world, he's using language with all of the kind of cultural recognition that these languages have come from different people, different places. So I think that's part of the conversation. It has to be part of the conversation, any conversation around Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth.
Yep. So I did promise we'll think about good and evil. Sometimes people say, okay, it's just a story of goodies and baddies, which I think runs into the issue that in the Lord of the Rings, it's actually quite complicated. The Gollum is a kind of a fallen hobbit who is corrupted by the ring, and even like Frodo is kind of is very corruptible and could be corrupted, and it's not that the goodies should get their hands on the power so they can defeat the baddies. It's not that. The answer to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. The answer to bad and good is to give up power, which is a very cruciform kind of thing. And so that's a really kind of complex story of good and evil. Yeah. And in these episodes, I think again we're not seeing a basic thing of goodies and baddies. Galadriel is a complex character all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think we resist a kind of good and evil simplification. There's concern about the white hats and black hats of kind of oversimplistic kind of ethics in the storytelling. I think, just reading through, that was one of the criticisms of Beowulf.
Okay.
And Tolkien talks about that. And he says that, some of the, other mythologists are saying, well, hold on, we've got the Iliad, and we've got the Odyssey. Look at these great southern mythologies with their complicated characters and all this kind of rich kind of stuff. And this Beowulf stuff is just far too kind of simplistic and Christian. And Tolkien says, well, I'm sorry that's how you feel, but there's more going on in these characters than that, and yet there is something to hold on to in this world building of Beowulf and in Middle-earth that you actually have nowhere to stand ethically or morally within something like the Iliad or within the Odyssey. There is a difficulty in getting your ethical bearings in those books.
Right.
And
the gods are rapists. It's kind of hard to,
And so to have, a vision or a view of theology, which is that God is the highest good and governs according to that, and that evil is an imposition. What was that first line from the...
Nothing is evil in the beginning.
Big first line.
Yeah,
and there was a time when the world was so young, there had not yet been a sunrise. But even then, there was light.
Now, we're imposing the idea that there was good in the beginning, rather than, and that this light was good, which is a profoundly, Christian thing to say, but that here to suggest that evil must enter in parasitically, must come secondarily, it must invade from that which was original. A huge part of Tolkien and Lewis and Chesterton's kind of narrative apologetics and all that sort of stuff.
And the thing that complexifies the whole thing is there's this story that it's told about Finrod, who is Galadriel's brother. And before he dies, he asks, and we referenced it already, do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? Because the stone sees only downward. The darkness of the water is vast and irresistible. The ship feels the darkness as well, striving moment by moment to master her and pull her under, but the ship has a secret, for unlike the stone, her gaze is not downwards but up, fixed upon the light that guides her, whispering of grander things than darkness ever knew. And again, you're sort of thinking, okay, there's a grand battle between good and evil, and the thing to do is to avoid falling down to the darkness and instead go up to the light. What does the hero do? Galadriel in episode 1, so it's not much of a spoiler, is offered heaven, as it were, and instead jumps ship.
Yeah.
And they even, we have a flashback to this quote from her brother, where she goes down into the darkness, but there is a struggle there. And I forget what. There's something that he whispers to her in that moment. That
touch the darkness. That's that. How will you know? I mean, she's sort of saying how.
She says there's lights above and there's lights reflected in the water. How do you know whether to go towards the light or the light that's reflected in the water? And he says something like,
"So said you've got to touch Justin Hawkins from the darkness, touching me." I think that's what she says. But arguably, you could put a Christian angle on that and say, well, unless you have gone into the pit, you'll never, and gone in through the darkness, you'll never see what the light is. I think there's something in that. I think what I think they're wanting to show is that the key thing is her freedom as an individual character. I think that's what they're trying to preserve. I don't think it's necessarily an anti-Tolkien idea. I think the characters are wrestling with things, and the power of evil and the power of power to corrupt is very strong in the books. It has a decaying quality upon the human soul. Yeah. And that is something that must be resisted. And when it cannot be resisted, someone else is going to have to step in and get rid of it for you.
Right.
I think, yes, I do think that the criticism of Lord of the Rings, that it's far too simplistic morally, is not really fair. I think here, it remains to be seen what they do with these characters and how they change.
I mean, Boromir is another good example, isn't he? Boromir. So I mean, I saw someone reacting to Lord of the Rings, and they were constantly on Boromir, going, "This guy's a bad dude," like yada yada yada. And it's like they completely missed the point that, of course, Boromir is being influenced by this ring, and it does something to him. It corrupts him. Yeah. But when he's free from that influence, actually, he says, "I would have gone with you." My captain, my king, and he obviously sacrifices himself for the sake of the hobbits. So that's all the way through Lord of the Rings, isn't it? That kind of thing.
Yeah. And those, those apparently pristine, morally upstanding groups. Mm-hmm. Well, they're not. If you actually look at what the Shire is like, and we've, the sense of gossiping and the sense of self-preservation, and they are being challenged through the story. Yes. To resist the temptations to prize comfort above all else. Right. That's clearly something the story is doing. It's similarly, the worlds of men, as we have here, are worlds which have begun to rot and decay. Right, there are stewards who will not give up their position. Right, they won't accede to the rightful heir or the rightful king. So you have all of that that's going on there, I suppose what's difficult is to see, the idea of Sauron as true evil, as a kind of as a resolutely evil character.
Yeah.
And that's probably what we have more of an issue with in the 21st century, is that any villain is unredeemable. But surely not. Wouldn't it be a better story if Sauron became friends? They all
Moana again.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
In like the Marvel universe, like Thanos is depicted, isn't he, as the big bad? But yet, when it comes down to it, you kind of go, well, he just wants to. He sees that the universe isn't sustainable with all these people. So he wants to wipe out half the population, but
it's a sacrifice his willies are making.
Yeah, you're like, maybe he's the good guy. Maybe he's onto the right thing. Like
the utilitarian hero. Yeah. And we'll see what happens with Sauron, because we don't know if we've already seen Sauron in these first 2 episodes. He will be embodied in the second age of the Lord of the Rings. He has not been named. Maybe we haven't yet met him. Maybe he is one of these mystery figures who we've already met. But I would bet money that Sauron will become complexified, and he's not all bad, is he? We'll see.
He just had a bad relationship with his
He had
mother.
his reasons.
Yeah.
He was bullied at school.
Might be it. Brilliant. Well, should we call it a day?
Yep, absolutely.
So many more things I want to read from these books, though, but I'll have to do them by myself. I do actually, before we do go,
go on,
want to recommend this little book, which is just quite a fun picture book. It's called John Ronald's Dragons: The Story of J.R.R. Tolkien by Caroline McAllister, illustrated by Eliza Wheeler. I can show that. It's just a really sweet little picture book. I mean, I think it's not exactly the most historically accurate genesis for John Ronald's Dragons, but certainly it just draws you in. And if you've got a young child who's interested in the things of Middle-earth and the lore and the folklore, then it's a great fun.
Before we leave, people, just want to say we just at the weekend had an event with Tom Holland and Paul Vanderklay, Christy Mayer up at Oak Hill, and it was a great afternoon and evening, and we packed out Oak Hill Theological College, and the video of that will be coming soon, so do stay tuned for that, and probably we'll have some podcast stuff from that. But Tom Holland was on excellent form, railing against religion GCSEs and thought for the day in typical Tom Holland form. It was delicious. Yeah. Stay tuned.
Brilliant. Great. Well, guys, thanks very much for the discussion. Hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you'll go out and check out Rings of Power, see what you think. Let us know down in the comments. And join us again next week for some more discussion. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.